Okay then, welcome back everyone to this first semester, semester one of 2021. I hardly remember what semester we're in with all the COVID stuff going on. Glad to see you all back safe and well. I'm delighted to welcome Peadar King here today. As you're probably aware, Peadar King is a filmmaker and writer. He has produced over 50 documentaries in almost 60 countries, including Africa, Asia, and the Americas. He's published a number of books, the latest of which is War, Suffering, and the Struggle for Human Rights. And Peadar tells me there's a copy or two in the library. And it's published by Liffey Press, if anyone's interested in acquiring their own copy. Peadar's particular interest in challenging how neoliberal capitalism has impacted on the poorest of the poor and on the livelihoods of people worldwide, particularly in the developing world. So without further ado, I will pass over now to Peadar. I will mute myself and turn off my camera, so we'll just leave it to Peadar. And we will take questions at roughly 20 to our start of discussion. Yeah, and that's it. So welcome everybody, and we'll see you all again after Peadar's presentation. So over to you, Peadar, and thank you again very much for agreeing to give this.
Thanks very much, Rosaria, and thanks to everybody for sacrificing or foregoing your lunchtime to be with us here today. So for this talk, I've taken the title of World at War, the Sustainable Development Goals, Ireland and the War Pandemic. And I'm trying to use the metaphor of pandemic as a way of getting us to think about war and as a way to conceptualize it. And obviously there's a huge literature emerging around the word pandemic now because of COVID. And you will find very different perspectives on the applicability of this word, not only in terms of a health context, but also, I think, in terms of war. But for me, the word pandemic reflects the scale and the extent, and indeed the way in which war has shaped the world in which we live. And in kind of settling on the word pandemic, I was trying to find a word that reflects that reality, that reflects the reality of the way in which war has been the default position of global world leaders for dealing with or sorting with what they perceive as major challenges in the world. So maybe in our discussion later on, we might even look at that word pandemic and think about whether that's a helpful tool or not in terms of understanding war. But irrespective of the language that we use, I think it is critically important that we talk about war, and I think it's critically important that we think about war. And in thinking about war, for me, because I suppose of the experiences I've had reporting from sites of war across Africa and the Middle East, and indeed in Latin America as well, that we need to think about the reality of war, and indeed the shocking reality of war. And in thinking about that, in the last few days while I was preparing this, I was trying to kind of see how can I convey that to us today, because very often war is an abstraction. It's certainly something that we are very, very far removed from. I mean, time and time again, people have said to me in Iraq and in Syria and in various other places that to know war, you have to live war. So how do we know war from this remove? How do we know war from this distance? How do we empathize with the suffering and the pain it causes? How can we empathize with the dead and the slowly dying? The injured and the injuries that never go away. And that's something else that people have said to me, again, time and time again, that in war, the injured envy the dead. Such is the extent of the physical pain, the emotional, the psychological, and the trauma in which they live through on a daily basis, and in some cases on an hourly basis. How do we comprehend the level at this remove, the level of destruction? And this image that I have here is from Aleppo, and I was there in December 2017, where half the city was utterly destroyed. I mean, that image just conveys a fraction of the level of destruction. How do we imagine, how do we empathize, how do we understand, how do we conceptualize that level of destruction at this remove? And then I mentioned the word trauma. I think most of us understand grief, or most of us at this hour of our lives might have experienced some grief. And yet, I think when we hear about the numbers of people killed in various atrocities across the world, it's very hard for us to comprehend that the level of grief that we too experience in our lives, kind of the natural grieving process that we experience, is no different from the grieving process that clings to people in a war situation. And I think it's even more difficult for people. The grieving is more difficult because, for the most part, and not always, in our cases, with older parents or whatever, there was inevitability about dying. Here, there isn't an inevitability about it. It's a deliberate act of killing, of murder, it's a deliberate act of destruction. And so that kind of grief that people experience in war situations is something for us that is difficult for us also to comprehend. And then there is the whole waste of it all, and the incomprehension that people experience when in a war situation, as to, you know, why me? Why has this happened to our community? Why has this happened to our family and our people and so on? So that's just in terms of war and pandemic. And in terms of war, for the purposes of this paper as well, I'm also talking about conventional militarized conflict that encompasses both conventional and nuclear weapons. So I'm not talking about the everyday race, gender, and class wars that are, of course, a feature of all societies. And in this discussion about war, I obviously want to do it in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And what I believe is the utter failure of the Sustainable Development Goals to confront one of the most deadly, and I mean that literally, one of the most deadly and insidious destructive forces in the world today. And as I said, that reality is reflected in that image. And there are numerous images, obviously, that I could use from Iraq and from you know, Somalia, Libya, South Sudan, and so on. So in thinking then about the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the things that struck me, even back in 2015, when you know, the Sustainable Development Goals have been announced with all the usual fanfare that accompanies these things, that what really is striking is the level of hyperbole that was given, you know, and that's typical of world leaders gathering at major stages like the United Nations for big event announcements. I mean, we've had that in Ireland as well, you know, with, you know, Bertie Hearn talking about 0.7% that Ireland was going to reach in terms of its development aid budget and so on. So these occasions are couched in that kind of grandiosity, verbosity, hyperbole, whichever term you want to use, without getting into the verbosity myself. So I want to actually look at those statements initially and do some kind of textual analysis, if you like, or some kind of interrogation of them. So we start with David Cameron. So this is what he had to say about at his speech at the United Nations. So I mean, look at the language and you know, the self-serving language, obviously.
Peadar, oh yeah, sorry. I was just going to say your slides hadn't moved, but they've just moved now. Sorry to interrupt you. Sorry.
Okay, all right, grand.
I'm not actually seeing any slides.
Oh.
That could be just me though.
Yeah, I can see them, Brian. All right. It's David Cameron's slide is up now. Peadar, is that what you want? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was able to move it on there myself. Maybe can you just try that in your own screens? I just moved it to number 2. Whatever way. Does that work for you, Brian?
No, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. Like, sorry.
I mean, that's like, is there anybody, like, I'm technically, I mentioned being in the Luddite corner earlier on. I'm afraid I can't really do anything to help. Rosario, is there anything you can do?
Yeah, can I just have a show of hands if everybody can see the slides, put up their hand, and that will mean that that'll indicate to me that you either see or you don't see. So I have, everybody has their hand up on the right. So I'm afraid, Brian, it looks like it's something to do with your computer.
That's no problem.
Yeah, sorry, no, I just.
Right, I'll be okay. First of all, if you can allow yourself to picture an image of David Cameron, you can pick whichever one you like. and I'll be kind of talking through the text a bit anyway.
That's
right?
great. No, that's perfect. Thanks. Sorry to interrupt.
Apologies about that. But so this is an extract from the speech, and as I said, you know, now we don't have time to do a complete textual analysis of all of these clips that I'm going, or extracts that I'm going to put up, but I think it's really interesting to look at them. So his opening line is, "We adopt these new goals, let's inspire the world," right? So, you know, this is and I'll highlight this later, this is one coming from one of the countries that is a major producer of weapons in the world, is a major funder of some of the major conflicts in the world. And I'm thinking in particular of what's happening in Yemen and the arms deals the United Kingdom has with the likes of Saudi Arabia. So it's almost as if none of that is acknowledged, or even that all of that kind of is part. So, and it's that kind of self-serving rhetoric that we have around it. So let's inspire the world with what we want to achieve. And then he goes on to talk about, this is a clarion call to the world, right, from the British, one of the great kind of imperial powers, and still has, if you think what happened, Britain's role in the war in Iraq, Britain's ongoing war, and even if you think of the more recent deal between Britain, the United States, and Australia that has put the French nose so much out of joint. So it's a clarion call to the whole world to prevent, to reduce preventable deaths. Now, one of the best and the most and the easiest way that Britain could reduce preventable deaths in the world is by turning off the cash flow to the arms industry. It could do that overnight. It can't address poverty overnight or the climate crisis overnight. But this is one thing it could do, but one thing that it will never do, and will not even acknowledge that this would reduce preventable deaths. And then he goes on to talk about that this clarion call to the world, this desire to end the scourge of extreme poverty, is something that has been dreamed about for centuries, something that many thought would never happen, but is now within our grasp. Of course, aspects of that are within the British government's grasp, but the aspects that are within the British government's grasp are the very aspects that it refuses to countenance. So in many ways, and the whole Sustainable Development Goals is a kind of a mask that powers can wear, behind which they hide the reality of their participation in and their contribution to the global war pandemic. needless to say, in Cameron's speech, he made no reference to war. And here you have Obama, again, the master rhetorician, if that is even a word. And many of our nations, especially developed nations, are among a general population, a general compassion towards those in need. Well, that's really questionable. And it's really questionable from the perspective of the United States. Like, where is the evidence that there is genuine compassion towards those in need? There is a recognition of the grinding poverty that so many experience every day around the world. Well, where is that recognition? Where is the evidence of that? And yet sometimes it's said that our efforts to combat poverty and disease do not and cannot work, that there are some places beyond hope, that certain people in regions are condemned to an endless cycle of suffering. Here today, we put those myths to rest. Now, that's not true. And we know that in the whole kind of war enterprise, at the center of war enterprise are lives. In 1914, 1918, it was the war to end all wars. That was a lie. And you can trace lies at the heart of public pronouncements by political leaders right across the 20th century, irrespective of the war that you're talking about. The war in Iraq was the war to liberate people, George W. Bush said. That was a lie. What's interesting is that Obama made 3 references to war. But if you look at it, at the references that he made to it, I think it's really, really interesting in that it avoids the culpability of the United States. And as I'll highlight later, the 3rd largest exporter of arms in the world. But it avoids any culpability by the United States in the war enterprise. So where does conflict come from in Obama's speech? It comes from bad governance. That's Africa for you. The basket case of Africa. Let's feed that stereotype a little bit, right? We have high inequality. Now, he doesn't actually reference Africa, but generally speaking, when people talk about bad governance, they talk about the global South. We have high inequality and we have discrimination against minority groups and ethnic groups. And so that, at the heart of his piece, I think, is utter denial of the role and complicity of the United States in the war machine. Hollande's speech, I had great difficulty finding it for, which might be interesting in itself. But I thought it was worth putting it in because also France is a key contributor, and I'll highlight that later on, of the war effort and the global war enterprise. So let's then look at bring it home a little bit to Enda Kenny when he was teaching. And again, there's very often, I think, a competition between public leaders for who has the most kind of dramatic language, who's going to make the statement, the big statement, and there's almost a competition between them for who's going to make the bigger statement, the bigger claims, and so on. So Kenny's speech, and this is an excerpt from an action to end extreme poverty and hunger and undernutrition and make better, faster progress on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. Action to promote the critical rule of good governance and the rule of law. All right. I'm always interested in the way women and girls, which is, you're never very sure whether that's one category or two, is invoked by world leaders when it suits their purposes. And of course, we see that now very much in terms of when the Taliban have taken over, that suddenly there's all of this concern about women and girls, as if women and girls' rights have been absolutely safeguarded in regimes that preceded the Taliban, or indeed even in the host countries that now talk, Ireland included, that talk about the protection. What's really interesting, of course, is that Kenny made no reference whatsoever to Ireland's complicity in the global war pandemic. And that complicity, and I'll highlight that later on again, is to be found in the use of Shannon Airport. And we are complicit. There's no question about it. At least that's the key argument that I'm making here. Okay, so what I want to do is to, I know very many of you will be very, very familiar with this kind of material. So, so in terms of starting off, I was interested in trying to conceptualize what we mean by war and finding a language that makes us think about it. But we also, I think, we need to be reminded of the evidence that we are actually living in one of the least peaceful times in the world currently. And like I've said that before at various fora that I've talked to, and people are really kind of amazed at that because if you think in the post Second World War scenario, you've had Vietnam War, you've had the Korean War, not obviously in that sequence, and then you have the plethora of wars right across Africa. You've had the genocide in Rwanda, genocide as well in the Congo, even though it hasn't talked about that. But even allowing for all of those in the post-Second World War context, that the fact is that we're now living in one of the least peaceful phases of recent history. So I find this Global Peace Index really, really useful. I have a hard copy of this paper as well, and I've all the sources for this, so I can give those sources later on. So, and I can give a copy of this as well later on. So this year's results show that the average level of global peacefulness deteriorated by 0.7%. And this is the 9th deterioration in peacefulness in the last 13 years, with 87 countries improving and 73 recording deteriorations. Now, it'll be no surprise, I suppose, that Afghanistan is the least peaceful country in the world for the 4th consecutive year, followed by Yemen, Syria, South Sudan, and Iraq. All except Yemen have been ranked amongst the least peaceful nations since at least 2015. And of course, the war in Iraq began in 2015. So I think that explains that anomaly. With Afghanistan having been ranked amongst the 3 least peaceful nations since 2010. So that's all kind of fairly standard stuff that I think most people will not be surprised by. But what I think is really interesting is 8 of the 10 countries at the top of the GPI are located in Europe. So this is the most European countries to be ranked in the top 10 in the history of the index. So and that goes back to what I was saying earlier on, the extent to which we're inured from the reality and protected from the reality of war. And then, of course, in terms of actual expenditure, there was an increase in military expenditure at GDP for the 2nd straight year, with 105 countries deteriorating on this index. So speaking of then, in terms of the financing of the global war pandemic, so world military expenditure is estimated to have been at 1,822 billion in 2018. So it was 2% higher in real terms than in 2017 and 5.4% higher than it was in 2009. So global military spending has been gradually rising. It is now 76% higher than it was in 1998. And 1998, for people of our age, and I'm kind of looking at the people who were featured, or all of us who were featured, we all can remember 1998, all of us here today. So it has increased 76% in that time, which is a phenomenal. And what I haven't gotten into in this paper, because we really don't have the time, is in terms of development, like the opportunity costs of that. Not to mention the environmental costs and the climate change costs and all the other costs that one can think of in association with that figure. So total spending was 2.6% higher in 2009 and then in 2009 and 9.3% higher in 2011. So the 5 biggest spenders in 2018 were the United States, with a population of 332 million. China, 1.4 billion. But Saudi Arabia is third in terms of its expenditure. So it with a population of 34.8 million, which is the 41st highest population in the world, is actually the third highest spender on military. So proportionately, Saudi Arabia is the biggest threat to world peace. And we see that biggest threat to world peace that has unfolded, particularly in Yemen. And then France. And we see that the French nose was completely out of joint recently because of the deal between Britain, the US, and Australia. So why we're not getting enough of our action on this kind of the military windfall, and feels its nose is out of joint and feels it has to recall its ambassador from the United Nations. Successive US governments since 2001 have spent $8 trillion on Afghanistan. On the war on terror. To give you an idea what 8 trillion is, that's 8,000 billion or 8 million million. And this is all on George Bush's global war on terror. And Joe Biden, in his defense of withdrawal from Afghanistan, said that it cost the US 300 million a day for 20 years. I mean, these are phenomenal figures. And as I said, if you think of the opportunity cost. So in terms of the countries then, and this relates back to the statements that Obama had made at the launch of the US, at the millennium, or at the SDGs. No reference was made to the fact that 37%, so he talked about the need to address conflict. But as I mentioned at the outset, his complicity and his country's complicity in the global war pandemic was never referenced. And yet we see that they hold 37% of the market share. France, 82%, Germany, 5.5%, the UK, 3.3%, Spain, 3.2%, and Italy, 2.2%. So what's really interesting, if you think back what I was saying, is that Europe is the safest place in the world in terms of where to live. But yet, is it five? Let me just count them again, sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, 5. So half of the biggest exporters of war are in Europe. And if that isn't sufficient to cause us to kind of wonder at how Europe relates to the world, and what's really interesting as well is how the European Union, the role that it plays in the export of arms. And what is also particularly interesting is Ursula von der Leyen's most recent statement as president of the Commission, where she has argued that what we need to do is increase European defense. So rather than look at how Europe and the European Union can begin to reduce its militarized footprint in the world, the likes of Ursula von der Leyen are arguing how we can increase that. And what was really interesting about that from my perspective is there was no outcry about that in Ireland. None of the politicians in Ireland questioned that. Not even the politicians, like the so-called politicians on the left, like the Labour Party and so on. Nobody made reference to that because we can't actually, we can't be seen to challenge Ursula von der Leyen because, that might have adverse consequences for us. So the silence in relation to the European drive towards increased defense spending, increased militarization of its borders, that has not featured in debates. I mean, we'll talk about Catherine's poem until the cows come home, because that's okay to talk about that, because in the end it's like, it's easy to understand that. But will we talk about this? Obviously not. I was going to, I'm just conscious of time. I was going to give you a quote from that, but I'm actually going to skip that. I've been reading last year and this year, I've been reading Margaret Macmillan's book on war, which is fantastic, which is really, really good. I actually saw a review of it in the Irish Times, and I bought it immediately. And I think and there's a lot of stuff in it that and Rosario and I were talking about it earlier on before this session, where there's a lot of reference to philosophers and I was saying, gosh, I was sorry I didn't pay more attention when I was in college to that particular course. But anyway, leaving that aside, she talks about trying to understand, well, what is war? And these are two definitions that I've come across that I think are really useful to us. And the first one is from the German theorist Klaus von Clausewitz. He argues that war is an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. And I kind of like that for its simplicity. And that's what it is. It's about Western powers, and it's about Europe attempting or trying to compel other countries and other cultures and other civilizations and other peoples to bend to our will, to fulfill to our will. Now, the English political theorist Hedley Bull has entered a caveat in that discussion, and he says violence is not war unless it's carried out in the name of a political unit against a political unit. So, in other words, he says if two people have a fight in the pub, which is the example he gives, that's not war. So it has to be there has to be an economy of scale. It has to be one political entity against another. Now, he doesn't say one country against another, because of course the caliphate wasn't a recognized country, but it certainly was an entity to be taken account of. So now I want to turn my attention to Ireland's complicity and participation in the war. This is a photograph from Shannon Airport. Edward is on there from Shannon. And we know each other from there. And so there you have US soldiers in the airport in Shannon. Now, I haven't been in Shannon Airport in a while, but as Edward might confirm this later on, that I now think that the US Army presence has been sidelined or has been shunted off in a way in which there's no mixing between kind of people, civilians using the airport and military using the airport. So these are people off to war and facilitated in Shannon. And one of the things that I've been reading, and just finished, in fact, is Claire Daly and Mick Wallace have brought out a book this year. So in 2014, really at the behest of Ellen Shatter in the Dáil, because they were constantly raising issues in the Dáil at a US presence in Shannon. And apparently, the law is that U.S. presence can be in Shannon provided they're not carrying arms, and so Claire and Mick were raising this constantly in the Dáil, and Alan Shatter, who was Minister for Justice at the time, said, "Well, if you can give us the evidence, right, then we'll act on it." So they thought, okay, so they scaled the fence in 2004 and went into the airport, for which they were prosecuted. Now, the book that they brought out is really good because it gives you an actual transcript of the whole court case. And there was evidence from the likes of Dennis Halliday, former Assistant Secretary General to the United Nations, Dr. Don Cloonan, former security correspondent of the Irish Times, and also a former member of the Defence Forces in Ireland. And while Judge Patrick Durkin, who's briefly former Fine Gael senator, found against Daly and Wallace, what is really interesting is he accepted the evidence that the people that they brought to give evidence in the case. He accepted all the evidence. So this is a really, really remarkable outcome, I think, because here you have a public forum, an arm of the state, no pun intended, acknowledging the evidence that was presented at the trial by at the trial of Daly and Wallace. And amongst the, I mean, there were other people as well, Ed Horgan, who's part of Shannon Watch, who've done amazing work, and we'll come to some of Ed's work in a moment. All of that evidence was accepted, and amongst the evidence that was accepted was that 3 million US soldiers have passed through Shannon in the last 20 years. Now that's our participation in the global war pandemic. That's what we are doing. It's I think it's what, 60 kilometers from where we're standing. It's where I lived and where I worked as a second level teacher for a number of years as well. Right? And this is what it looks like. So these are some of the US military hardware that you typically see in Shannon. And if you look close at that image, you will see US soldiers kind of walking around in Shannon in Irish on their way to war. So this is a Hercules, just so you know, a Hercules EC130H. And this photo was taken by Ed Horgan, whom I mentioned earlier, at 11:15 on the 3rd of June this year. So that's as recent as it gets. So to give you an idea what this is capable of, the aircraft is heavily modified, and I'm reading a quote here, so just bear with me for a moment. The aircraft is heavily modified to disrupt enemy command and control communications, perform offensive counter-information operations, and carry out other kinds of electronic attack. EC-13H can be deployed worldwide at short notice to support US and allied tactical air, surface, and special operational forces. It can suppress enemy air defenses while jamming communications, radar, and command and control targets. That's what we're facilitating. That's what's on our Irish soil. And there you have 4 of them lined up to take off. And that photograph, I think, sorry, I don't have it when that photograph was taken.
Few minutes.
Yeah. So this is my final pitch. So these are essentially what I've been trying to say is, first of all, the global war pandemic is real. Secondly, that Ireland is an active participant in and benefits from the global war pandemic. Now, I think there's a huge piece of work to be done on the way in which Ireland benefits from the global war pandemic, down to how the research, the role of universities in research, the role that Irish foreign policy plays in fora like the United Nations at the moment, particularly now that we're on the Security Councils. It also, the SDGs did not address the war pandemic, failed to do so. Because key global players like Biden, Johnson, Macron, Merkel, Putin, Xi Jinping, and now van der Leyen did not and do not want to confront the war pandemic, because for their countries and their political lifeblood, corporate donations and all that goes with it, they all benefit from the pandemic. And the ultimate failure of the SDGs, I would argue, is the absence of any commitment to agree targets to reduce the global spend on weapons of mass destruction. And that, in my view, fatally undermines the SDGs. That's it. Thanks very much for listening to that.
Thank you so much, Peadar. That was wonderful. And yes, I see applause coming from the participants. Wonderful whistle-stop tour, and yet very comprehensive account of the war pandemic. I'd like to open up the floor to questions. Feel free to put on your cameras, keep yourself on mute unless you're asking a question. And I'm sure there are lots of discussion points people would like. So I see hands up. I'll try and take them in order. I'll just get out the list of participants here, and so I see Claire. Claire, here you have a question, and then yeah, I'll come on to the next person then. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you very much, Peadar, for a fascinating presentation. Really, really appreciated. I just wondered, given everything that you've laid out here, what can we as ordinary citizens, or can we do anything that might influence a change process in this? What I suppose what I'm asking is, what kind of resolutions would you suggest, or what can be put in place? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for your generous comments on it. I mean, okay, look, that's a really, really big question, and it's a very difficult question. And you know, I don't pretend to have, you know, and the last thing we want are kind of easy answers or, you know, reductionist positions to take. But I do think there are a number of things we can do. First of all, I think that it's really important to get information out. It's really important to give witness to what is happening. I remember Nancy Schaefer-Hughes, the anthropologist, talking one day, and she said the work of the anthropologist is the work of witness, and you hear that said in other contexts as well. So I think the first thing is the act of witness that can be done, and we can all do that in all various in various fora. The second thing, I think universities are in a privileged position to do research on this, and also to do interrogation within their own institution as to what role, if any, does this institution play in the global war pandemic. And in doing that research, I think there is an onus on people within the university to confront the authorities in universities about any complicity that there might exist with the universities. I noticed in UCC, like the new president, and he was talking about being the first green president. Okay, well, let's, no pun intended on this, but let's see the color of your money, sir. Like, is UCC complicit in the global war pandemic? And if it is this compatible with your commitment to be the first green president in Irish universities? I mean, like, let's cut to the chase here, guys. All right. So that's the second thing that I think can be done. And also, you know, there's a huge impetus, or that's not the right word. There's an emphasis, I think, within the SDGs that we can't question them. We can't kind of open them up for discussion, because in some ways, if we do that, we run the risk of undermining them. So let's all kind of hang together around the SDGs, and let's make sure they all are met, and we put the pressure on them. And if we begin to question them or begin to query them, then we're kind of undermining our own work. That's a position I don't support at all. Right? Like, in some sense, you know, the SDGs in some sense could be argued as the low-picking fruit. You know, of course that's not entirely true, or that's not true really at all. But it is curious as to why the major powers agreed to them in the first place. Why? Because it wasn't going to impact on them. It wasn't going to affect their domestic policy. It wasn't going to affect their political base. It wasn't going to affect, which in the United States, the extraordinary amounts of money that are required to keep the political machines going. It wasn't going to affect any of them. And if it were, they wouldn't have agreed to them in the first place. So I do think there is something about bringing a really strong critique around these SDGs as well. So there are three things.
Thank you, Peadar. We have
Thank you, Peadar. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your question, Claire. We have three questions in quick succession. I'd ask each person to keep it brief as possible. That would be great. We'll start with John Barimo, then we'll have Gertrude, and then we'll have Brian. And hopefully we may have time for more questions after that, but we'll just have that for now. So John, go ahead, please.
I just like to say I do very much appreciate your presentation, right on in so many ways. I'm actually a U.S. veteran and a member of Veterans for Peace, so I do feel very strongly about this. And I think it's very important to point out that the U.S. military is a larger carbon emitter than most countries in the world. But I think one thing that could be done locally is, and I'd like to know your opinion on this too, it was around 1947 after World War II, the Ireland actually signed agreements with the US about use of Ireland. And it really, at that point, Ireland gave away neutrality. So neutrality isn't quite as genuine and authentic, I don't think, in Ireland as it is put out to be sometimes. But it seems that that's a leverage point, and that could be something to steer this around, and is something that people can do to lobby for.
Okay, well, first of all, I agree with you on the climate change. The U.S. military is the single biggest emitter and contributor to climate change in the world. Now, I can't give you a precise reference to that, I'm afraid, off the top of my head, but I am happy to give you a source for that later on, if you wish. In terms of neutrality, of course, neutrality is nuanced by the political class here in Ireland to the extent that it is wholly ineffective. So they talk about, well, we're not neutral, we're militarily neutral, right? So that's the kind of the big caveat on it. I think that it's like a pious statement. One of the things I thought was really interesting as well, and I hope this isn't sidestepping your key question, but when Ireland was canvassing for a seat on the Security Council, it was up against Canada and Norway. So there were 3 candidates and 2 seats available. So they were really big countries. Norway has a very big overseas aid development budget. And Canada, of course, one of the big players on the global stage. And if you go back and look at the booklet that the Department of Foreign Affairs produced, which I have done, what's really interesting is highlights its neutrality as a way of engaging with countries, particularly in Africa and Latin America, to support their candidature. So it's a real flag of convenience when Ireland wants a flag of convenience, and it actually worked. So Ireland did get a seat on the UN Security Council. Now, in my opinion, for what it's worth, Ireland should have boycotted the UN Security Council. It's an utterly non-democratic, corrupt, well, it's not corrupt, but it's a non-democratic block on any kind of democratic engagement within the UN. So that's I hope that's very briefly addressing your question on neutrality.
Thank you, Peadar. Thanks, John, very much for your question and your comments. That was very insightful and interesting. Gertrude, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Peadar. That was brilliant as usual. And it's not a question really, it's just a comment about, for instance, UCC and Green President and all of that. It's always easier in institutions like UCC to talk about green in an environmental sense and nice, safe little targets and stuff. Not that they're unimportant or anything, but it is much harder when it comes to anything political. And you know, I think we need to do that kind of research. I can't emphasize how much I agree with you in that, you know, if we're not doing it in somewhere like UCC, I don't know where you can do it in this kind of a country. You know, we're in a very privileged position. I don't mean just by being in UCC, but I mean by being in Ireland, because it's safe for us to, you know, generally to express ourselves, but it can feel very unsafe. I've just done some research over the last year with what is currently 30 staff, and we've had some very deep discussion around these kinds of issues. And I know now from talking to a lot of people, the fear that is there of speaking up, including some of the people who are here. And I think particularly people who are not in an academic position. So there is a fear. And I just want to record as well, as Claire was asking at the beginning about what we can do. We can certainly research our own institution and have our voices collectively heard, which we did very successfully last year on an issue to do with university that we were working with in China, where minority groups were being treated and still are, But, you know, it was very hard to talk about that openly. About 90 staff, however, did come together. But that is the way we have to come together if there are these kinds of issues, and we need to be able to be willing to do it together. And if the people here aren't able to do it, I don't know who is. So there are a lot of issues that are very hard to address, and they shouldn't be in an open university, you know, in a country like Ireland in this day and age. It's ridiculous. And the second thing then is, I was thinking about something Claire said, and I was thinking of looking at some of the pictures of Shannon. I remember going on, for some reason, I don't know why, I was on Joe Duffy, and it was, I don't normally listen to it, but they were talking about Shannon. And Angus McAnally is the researcher, and he spoke to me first before I went on. No, I didn't go on because he wouldn't let me on, which I made a complaint because he totally disagreed with my point. And he said, surely you are not serious. What he actually said, and I paraphrase, is, you are not serious, Ali, saying to me that you think that we should all queue up rather than have the military there or something like that. I was saying, I don't know why they're actually here. The US government are here anyway. I don't know what kind of way the conversation was, but the point I'm trying to make was, that he was trying to make the point it would take everybody a lot longer if the military weren't there, which had absolutely nothing to do with the long queues in Shannon. But anyway, but I think what amazed me was that somebody in his position, which is, it is an influential show. I mean, I can't stand it personally, but it has influence. And somebody in his position was kind of blocking a conversation, and I suppose it was just his absolute, I mean, I know this is just one incident, but his absolute ignorance, totally ignorance of the issues in a position that he's in was what made me very angry. I still feel very angry about it. And I suppose, there's something about the media, and this is when Claire asked that question at the beginning, and influencing the media and stuff. And I think that's something else that we can be thinking about. Thank you for rant now over.
That's a very thoughtful rant and thought-provoking rant, Gertrude. So thank you for that intervention. But Brian, can I pass over to you?
Yeah, just a brief comment first. I've never quite understood why the US military land in Shannon, when certainly there used to be, if not still are, US military air bases only a few hundred miles to the east of us in the UK. So I've never quite understood the need for them to stop to refuel in Shannon when they could just, fly for an extra half hour and land at their own air bases. But at the risk of, if you'll excuse the pun, throwing a complete grenade into the conversation, I wonder, do we need to look at ourselves and our attitudes towards war? The reason I ask that is because this year we are celebrating the centenary of our War of Independence. So, and it's not just the government. The people are celebrating the centenary of a war. So are there such things as just wars? Or are all wars a bad thing? So, I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I mean, it's just something that occurs to me that, I agree with everything you've said, Peadar, and I think one of the biggest problems here is that actually war is big business, and that companies are making billions on billions of profits on the back of war. But yet we also have this bit of our culture that celebrates our war because we were right to go to war, and so it's an uncomfortable kind of dichotomy, if you like, and I just wonder, do we need to kind of reflect on that? That's a bit of a curveball, I know, but there you go.
In terms of bases, there are no shortage of bases. The US have 800 military bases right around the world. And in Italy alone, they have 90 bases in Italy. So you're absolutely right. Why they have to use, and by the way, Shannon is not one of those. Shannon is not an official US military base. So why they have to use Shannon is, it's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. So in terms of the other kind of broader issues that you raise, I mean, some people would say we're commemorating Irish independence, not celebrating it. So there's all of that kind of language, and I think the language we use is really important, and I was trying to address that at the outset. Is war ever justified? Okay. That's a huge question, and with what, 2 minutes to go, can I park it?
I kind of threw it out there more just for something that we all maybe need to reflect upon. So
yeah. No, it's an important question. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian, for that question. That is a very good question. And of course, you have the view of the conscientious objectors as well, and all of that. So as Peadar said, that would be a big area, but nonetheless a very interesting question you raised. If that's all the questions from everybody, I'd like to thank most sincerely Peadar for a wonderful, I don't want to say whistle-stop tour because it's sort of, it might diminish the impact that you've had, but you've had a fantastic, gave a fantastic presentation and got us to think, I think a lot of us outside the box about and ask searching and very challenging and critical questions around the war pandemic. It's a term I found interesting when you first sent it in at my request, and I was interested to see how you would tease it out. So I feel far more enlightened now, and certainly gives another lens to examine the SDGs and the bigger picture and what actually the SDGs might be concealing, in the background. It's sort of like almost like a decoy or something to the bigger picture. So with that, I'd like to thank you most sincerely on behalf of everybody, on behalf of the Centre for Global Development board members who are online, including Nick and Claire and Edward and Barbara, and all of the UCC staff and students online. Thank you all for joining us. We will have another one next Tuesday. I don't have the title yet, but it will be circulated later on in the week. So we look forward to seeing you all then. And from me, Rosarie Griffin. And again, thank you, Peadar, so much for a great presentation. Full of us from everybody. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.